We have to look at calories relatively, not absolutely. So it only matters how many calories in context. Because sometimes I'll have somebody ask me, hey, look at this thing. Is it good? Is it a good amount of calories? And then you have to look at it. Okay, is 400 calories a lot for somebody who is 5'2" and has a 1,200 calorie target for the day? Probably. Is it a lot for somebody who's 6'4" and has like a 3,300 calorie goal that day? Probably not. It probably actually doesn't have much of an effect. So calories are just as much relative and contextual as anything else. The amount of energy you're expending just as much as the energy that you're taking in. So when someone says, oh, they're able to eat so much, it's because they need to maintain that much energy. Their body needs that much energy just to stay alive, just to function. And if you're a little bit smaller, you need a little bit less. The cool thing is you also need a little bit less exercise compared to that person if they wanted to burn, right? You will see a relatively bigger change. But that's an aside. The amount of calories that you're taking in is all relative. Relative to you, contextual to you, but also to what you have left for the day. So let's say you eat 5 meals a day and each meal is 500 calories. That's 2,500 calories for the day. Is it a lot? Maybe. If your goal was only 2,000, that's too much. If your goal was 3,500, you still have 1,000 calories left, right? Again, it's all relative. So I want you to stop looking at calories as an absolute. It's usually relative to what you have left. Yes, you will find certain types of foods have more calories. They're more calorie dense compared to other ones who are a little bit less calorie dense. Typically, vegetables have less calories but more nutrients per unit. They're not calorie dense, and they're vitamin and nutrient dense, as opposed to some other foods that tend to be a little bit more calorie dense and nutrient deficient. So it's all relative. How many meals you've had in a day, how big these meals are, it says whether that amount of calories is a lot. So that how much calories you typically burn, that has an influence on it. So it's all relative. It's a flux. It's a moving fluid response to that question, because it is all relative to how much energy you're expending, how much energy your body needs, how much energy you're taking in already, what your budget is for the day, etc., etc., etc. So when you start looking at calories, I want you to look at it a little bit more fluidly and more like a relative number as opposed to an absolute number.